Him standing on the side of an old two-lane road deep in Scott County, Virginia. Today, it's just a quiet stretch of asphalt winding through the ancient woods of the Blue Ridge. The only sounds are the wind moving through the hickories and the distant cry of a hawk. But this isn't just any road. This is a place of echoes, because it was right here, nearly 100 years ago, that the silence was shattered by a struggle that ended a life and began a legend. A beloved young schoolteacher vanished from this very spot, leaving behind nothing but her car, her hat, and a mystery that haunts these mountains to this day. Let's turn back the clock. Forget the asphalt beneath my feet, and imagine a ribbon of red clay and gravel snaking its way through these same mountains in the fall of 1928. This was a world caught between two ages. Cabins with smoke curling from their stone chimneys stood not far from homes with newfangled telephones. Men still lived by the seasons and the old codes of the mountains, but the hum of the modern world was growing louder, carried in on the radios and the new automobiles that were just beginning to appear on these rough-and-tumble roads. Into this world stepped June Crabb. At 21, she was the very picture of that modern world. She was educated, bright, and filled with a quiet determination that set her apart. She was the teacher at the little one-room, big-cut schoolhouse, a position of immense respect in a community that valued learning but had few who could provide it. She represented a promise, a bridge between the old ways of the mountains and the possibilities of the world beyond. Every morning, she would make the drive to her schoolhouse, and every afternoon, she would drive back. And she did it in her very own Ford coupe. You have to understand what a sight that was back then. In a land where most people still relied on a mule or their own 2 feet, a young woman, independent and in command of her own machine, was a powerful symbol. That car wasn't just transportation, it was a declaration of freedom. It was her future, rolling along the dirt roads of the past. Her students adored her. For the children of coal miners and farmers, she was a window to a bigger life. She taught them arithmetic and literature, but more than that, she taught them that a girl from Scott County could achieve anything. At home, she was a beloved daughter. Her family, especially her father, saw in her the fulfillment of a dream, that their children would have more opportunities than they ever did. June Crabb wasn't just a person. She was the pride of her family and a beacon for her community. But this land, for all its beauty, held a deep and abiding sense of isolation. The forests that surrounded these roads were dense and ancient, capable of swallowing any secret. It was a place where everyone knew each other's business, yet the most important things often went unsaid. The very independence that made June a symbol of progress also made her a solitary figure on that lonely drive home, a single point of light traveling through miles of deep, dark woods. On the afternoon of Friday, September 14th, she dismissed her students for the weekend, gathered her books, and started her Ford coupe for a journey she had made countless times before, completely unaware it would be her last. Now, I'm not a detective from 1928. I don't have access to the original evidence bag, but local archives, God bless them, they keep everything. And in the files for this case, there are detailed descriptions and, in some accounts, a grainy photograph of the most important clue found at the scene. It's a simple thing, really. A lady's cloche hat, the kind every fashionable young woman wore in the 1920s. Looking at a picture of it, you can almost feel the felt. It's unassuming, maybe with a small ribbon or a simple pin. But this hat is the key to understanding the first terrifying moments of June's disappearance. Her school books were on the seat, her paycheck was in her purse, but her hat was on the floorboard of the car, reportedly scuffed and slightly crushed, as if it had been knocked from her head in a sudden violent motion. You see, back then, a hat wasn't just an accessory. It was an essential part of a woman's public identity. A respectable young teacher like June would no more leave her car without her hat than she would without her shoes. Its presence on that floorboard was a silent, desperate scream. It told the searchers, and it tells us now, that this wasn't an elopement. This wasn't a young woman running away. She was taken, ripped from her car, fighting for her life. This simple, forgotten object transforms the scene from a mystery into a portrait of violence and raises the chilling question, who in this tight-knit community would dare to lay hands on June Crab? The truth is, the deepest dangers in these mountains rarely come from a faceless stranger passing through. The real threats have names and faces and history. And while the lawmen looked for some wandering tramp, the whispers in the hills told a different story. They spoke of a young man, the son of a family whose name carried the weight of land, money, and influence. A young man who walked through the world as if he owned it, because in many ways he and his family did. He'd taken an interest in June Crab. It was the kind of attention a hawk pays a songbird. He saw her independence not as something to be admired, but as a challenge. He saw her beauty as something he was entitled to. By all accounts, he made his intentions known, expecting her to be flattered by the attention of a man from such a powerful clan. But June Crab was not a prize to be won, and she was not easily intimidated. She turned him down. Politely, the stories say, but with a firmness that left no room for argument. And for a boy raised to believe the world owed him everything, that simple no, delivered in plain sight of the community, was a public slap in the face. It was an insult to his pride, and more importantly, to the pride of his family name. The tension began to simmer then. A resentful stare held a second too long at the town mercantile, a muttered comment about the city girl teacher and her fancy automobile. It wasn't just a personal rejection anymore. To him and to his kin, June Crab and everything she represented, her education, her confidence, her refusal to bow to the old order of things, was a threat. The conflict wasn't over a single word. It was a clash between the old power of blood and land and the new power of a woman's own will. And in the heart of Appalachia in 1928, that was a conflict that could only fester and grow, like a poison ivy vine climbing the side of an old stone wall. These old mountain stories don't live in dusty court records. They live in people. They're passed down from grandmother to granddaughter, whispered over quilting frames and snapping beans on the porch. To find the heart of this story, you have to find one of those keepers of memory. I found one, an elderly woman living in a small white house not 5 miles from where June Crab's car was found. Her mind is as sharp as a newly honed axe, and her great-aunt was one of June's closest friends. She sat me down in her living room, a room filled with the quiet ticking of a grandfather clock and the scent of lemon oil and old wood. She told me the official story of the jilted lover was close, but it missed the most important part. It wasn't just a private rejection. It was a public humiliation, the kind a powerful family in these parts would never, ever forgive. It happened at the church social, just a few weeks before, she said, her voice a soft, papery rustle. The young man from that powerful family, full of corn liquor and arrogance, cornered June by the dessert table. He wasn't asking for her company. He was telling her she would grant it. In front of half the county, he tried to put his hand on her, to claim her like a piece of property. And June, in her quiet, dignified way, moved his hand off her arm and put him in his place. Her great-aunt said she didn't yell or make a scene. She just used words, calm, clear, and sharp as glass. She told him that her time and her person were her own, and not for him to command. The crowd went silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the grass. The young man's face went from white to red, and the look in his eyes, the old woman told me her aunt had said, was a look of pure, murderous rage. He had been shamed in front of everyone by the very woman he sought to possess. My great-aunt always said that was the moment it was sealed, the woman finished, looking out her window towards the mountains. It wasn't about love anymore. It was about pride. And around here, a man's pride, especially a man from a family like that, well, it's a dangerous and fragile thing. She said his pride had been so badly broken, the only thing that could mend it was to break her. That public shaming at the church social was a lit fuse. For the young man, the laughter he imagined behind cupped hands, the knowing glances exchanged between neighbors, it was all a torment. But for his father, the patriarch of the clan, it was something far worse. It was a stain on the family name, a challenge to the authority they had held in these mountains for generations. In their world, power wasn't just held, it had to be seen to be held. And a young schoolteacher, an outsider in their eyes, had openly defied them and walked away unscathed. Shame in that world was a living thing. It sat at the dinner table with them, a silent, unwanted guest. It followed them into town, and it demanded to be cleansed. The discussions that followed were not about forgiveness or letting things go. They were quiet, cold, and took place in the shadows of the porch after dark. They were discussions of honor, of lessons that needed to be taught. The phrase that would have been repeated in one form or another was simple and deadly. She can't be allowed to get away with that. June likely felt the shift in the air, a friendly nod in town that was no longer offered, the sudden silence that fell when she entered the general store. Friends of her family may have even offered veiled warnings, telling her to be careful on her drive, to not stop for anyone. But June Crabbe was cut from a different cloth. She would not be scared away from her school, from her students, or from her life. She would not let a bully's pride dictate her path. Her courage, the very thing that made her so remarkable, was now painting a target on her back. The decision, when it was finally made, wasn't likely a shouted, furious thing. It was probably a quiet nod between father and son, a confirmation. The goal wasn't just to scare her. That time had passed. The goal was to erase the insult, to reassert their dominance in a way that would be so final, so absolute, that no one would ever dare challenge their family's honor again. They knew her schedule. They knew every curve and hollow of Fincastle Road. They knew the place where the woods grew thickest and the nearest house was miles away. The plan was set. The trap was baited with the mundane routine of a Friday afternoon. The point of no return had been crossed, not in the heat of a public argument, but in the cold, calculated whisper of a family's wounded pride. So I've come back to the spot on Fincastle Road. The modern pavement is a black scar laid over the memory of the old red clay, but the bones of the land haven't changed. And when you stand right here, you understand why they chose this place. The road takes a sharp, blind curve. On one side, the mountain falls away into a steep, wooded ravine. On the other, the forest floor rises up, thick with underbrush and ancient trees that crowd right up to the shoulder. There are no houses, no fields, just the road and the woods. There are no bullet holes in a wall here, no lone chimney standing against the sky. The scars on this landscape are more subtle. They are the tactical advantages of the terrain itself. This blind curve is a natural ambush point, a place where a waiting car could be hidden until the last possible second. The dense wall of trees is a perfect backdrop for a man to step out of, blocking the way. The silence itself is the evidence. Even now, with the world just a few miles away, this spot feels utterly and profoundly isolated. Right here, this patch of gravel on the shoulder of the road. You can almost see the ghosts. You can almost feel the change in the air as a familiar drive home turned into a nightmare. This is where June Crabbe's Ford coupe slowed to a stop. This is where a shadow detached itself from the other shadows of the forest. Each stone on this roadside, each root snaking out from the bank, is a silent testament to the terror of that afternoon. This is the stage, perfectly set for the heart of darkness that was about to unfold. As June rounded that last blind curve, the familiar rhythm of her journey home was broken. Another car, dark and hulking, was stopped sideways, completely blocking the narrow road. It was an unnatural sight, a silent black predator waiting in the path. Her foot moved to the brake, her mind racing through possibilities. Engine trouble, an accident. But the cold knot that formed in her stomach told her this was no chance encounter. This was a barricade, a trap. The driver's side door of the other car opened, and the young man from the church social stepped out. He was not alone. His father, or perhaps another man loyal to the family, emerged from the passenger side. There was no rage on his face now, only a flat, chilling sense of purpose. He walked slowly toward her Ford coupe, his boots crunching on the gravel, the sound unnaturally loud in the afternoon stillness. Junette's hand instinctively went to the door lock, but it was too late. The handle of her car door was wrenched from the outside, the metallic click echoing like a gunshot. The door was pulled open, and the last of the afternoon sun was blotted out as the man's shadow fell over her. There was no shouting, only a low, guttural command to get out, the air filled with the scent of whiskey and rage. What followed was a chaos of muffled sounds, a sharp, terrified intake of breath, the scuffing of her shoes against the running board, the ripping of fabric. Her hat was knocked from her head, tumbling to the floorboard in a confused blur. A single piercing cry for help escaped her lips, but it was immediately swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. The struggle was brief, brutal, and unequal. A moment later, the heavy slam of another car door echoed through the trees. Her own Ford coupe was left abandoned, its door still swinging slightly as if in a final silent wave goodbye. The waiting car roared to life, its tires spitting gravel as it turned and sped away, carrying June Crab deeper into the mountains, away from the road, away from everything she knew, and away from any hope of rescue. They drove for what must have felt like an eternity, turning off the main road onto a rough, barely there track that climbed higher into the wild heart of Clinch Mountain. The journey ended in a remote, briar-choked hollow, a place of deep shadows where the sun rarely touched the ground. They pulled her from the car. The final moments of her life were not witnessed by any person who would ever speak of it. There was no trial, no judge, no jury. Just the cold, hard finality of mountain justice. In the profound silence of that secluded place, a terrible act was committed. The only sound was a sudden, panicked flurry of wings as a flock of birds, startled by the violence below, erupted from the treetops and scattered into the darkening sky. Then, an awful, profound quiet settled back over the hollow. The men left as they had come, two ghosts melting back into the twilight, confident that the mountain would hold their secret forever. They left behind a life extinguished, a promise broken. The silence that returned was heavier than before, weighted with the knowledge of what it now concealed. In that forgotten thicket, the only thing that moved was a single oak leaf, spiraling slowly down to rest on a patch of newly disturbed earth. After the raw violence of the story, you turn to the official record, hoping for answers, for clarity. Instead, you find a different kind of coldness. I'm looking at copies of the pages from the Scott County Sheriff's file on the disappearance and death of June Crab. The paper is yellowed, the ink faded, but the words still tell a story, just not the one you're looking for. It's a story told in the dry, emotionless language of bureaucracy, a language designed to record facts while stripping them of all their human horror. Take the coroner's inquest, filed after her remains were found. It's a single page. Under cause of death, the report simply states, fractures of the cranium due to blunt force trauma. Just 6 clinical words to describe the brutal end of a vibrant, 21-year-old woman's life. It doesn't mention the lonely hollow, the terror of her final moments, or the year and a half her father spent walking these mountains, praying for a sign. The only humanizing detail is a small note. Remains identified by a gold-filled molar, consistent with dental records. A life reduced to a footnote in a ledger. But it's the sheriff's investigative notes that are the most telling, mostly for what they don't say. There are pages and pages detailing the search efforts, listing the names of volunteers and the areas they covered. There are dozens of dead-end leads scribbled down, reports of a suspicious-looking tramp seen miles away, a vague tip about a car from Tennessee. The official narrative being built on these pages is clear. This was the work of a phantom, An outsider who drifted in, did this terrible thing, and vanished. Yet as you read through the file, a glaring omission becomes a roar. The name of the powerful local family, the name everyone in the county was whispering, appears nowhere in these pages. Not once. There's no record of the son being questioned, no mention of the public incident at the church social. The official record is a perfect portrait of a blind eye being turned. It's a meticulously crafted document that leads everywhere except to the one place everyone knew to look. These papers aren't evidence of a failed investigation. They are the evidence of a successful and chillingly effective cover-up. In the weeks and months that followed June's disappearance, the mountains swarmed with men. It was a manhunt of epic proportions, a genuine outpouring of a community's grief and rage. Thousands of volunteers, their faces grim and determined, beat the bushes from sunup to sundown. They were honest, hard-working men, searching for a beloved teacher, hoping to bring a killer to justice. But the official arm of the law, the sheriff and his deputies, seemed to be working from a different map. While the volunteers combed the hollows near Fincastle Road, the sheriff was busy chasing phantoms. Every report of a stranger, a vagrant, or a man with an out-of-state accent was treated as a major lead. Posses were dispatched on wild goose chases, riding 20 miles in the wrong direction to question some poor, itinerant worker who couldn't have possibly been involved. They created a grand spectacle of a law enforcement agency working tirelessly to hunt down an outside evil. It was a brilliant piece of theater. It kept the community busy and directed the collective anger safely away from anyone with a powerful local name. After her body was found, the performance had to move from the mountains to the courthouse. A grand jury was convened, not to seek the truth, but to officially bury it. For days, witnesses were brought in, but they were the ones who had seen a suspicious tramp near the railroad tracks or an unfamiliar car on a distant road. The people who had been at the church social, the ones who had seen the public confrontation and the look of murderous rage on the young man's face, were never called to testify. The questions were carefully chosen, the path of inquiry meticulously routed around the truth. The verdict wasn't delivered in a packed courtroom by a jury foreman. It was delivered on the courthouse steps by the county prosecutor, a man who knew which families buttered his bread. He stood before the small crowd of reporters and heartbroken townspeople, his face a perfect mask of solemn regret. He announced that after an exhaustive investigation, the grand jury had found insufficient evidence to issue an indictment. He spoke of trails gone cold and the tragic reality of motiveless, random violence. With those few legal phrases, the case was officially closed. Justice had not been blind. It had been deliberately blindfolded. The law had pursued its course, but it was a course designed to lead to a dead end. As the crowd dispersed in a quiet, defeated murmur, the men from the powerful family, who had been watching from the back, could turn and walk away. The hunt was over. The law had pursued its quarry, and in the end had declared the monster to be a ghost, allowing the real flesh-and-blood killer to retreat back into the safety of the shadows, protected by a wall of money, power, and fear. Every story eventually ends in a quiet place like this. Him standing in an old church graveyard on a hill overlooking the valley, where the wind whispers through cedar trees, and the only sound is the crunch of my boots on fallen leaves. Most of the headstones are old, tilting, and covered in a soft green carpet of moss. But June Crabb's grave is not hard to find. Her family and those who remembered tended to it for years. It's a simple, modest stone with a small carved lamb at the top, a symbol of innocence. The dates carved into the weathered marble tell the whole tragic story. 1907, 1928, 21 years, a life that had barely begun. You stand here before this quiet stone, and you feel the weight of all that lost potential. The students she would have taught, the family she never had. It's a place of profound and lingering sadness. But the story doesn't end with this single stone. Because just 100 yards away, up on the crest of the hill, where the most prominent families are buried, there is another plot. It's a grand affair, marked by a large, polished granite monolith, the family name carved in big, proud capital letters for all the world to see. And there, in the shadow of that monument, is another grave. It's the grave of the young man who could never accept the word no. His dates tell a different story. He lived a long, full life, dying of old age, surrounded by family. They lie so close now, separated by a small patch of grass and an immeasurable gulf of sin. He, the perpetrator, under a proud stone proclaiming his family's legacy. She, the victim, under a humble marker of a life stolen away. You can't help but notice the cruel irony. Enemies in life, neighbors in death, resting in the same Appalachian soil. Looking from his grave back to hers, you're left with a haunting question. The law couldn't touch him. The community was too scared to. But what happened after? What was it like to live out those 60 or 70 years knowing what you had done? What shadows followed him home from that courthouse, and did they ever leave him be? After the courthouse doors closed and the official story was written, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over Scott County. For the Crabb family, it was the silence of a home hollowed out by grief. The light simply went out of their house. Junet's father, a man who had tirelessly walked every inch of these mountains searching for his daughter, was a broken man. He had lost his child, and then he had been forced to watch as her killer walked free, shielded by the very system that was supposed to protect them. They had no recourse, no appeal. To speak the truth aloud would have been to invite ruin, or worse, upon the rest of their family. So they carried their sorrow quietly, a private agony that would follow them to their own graves. For the young man and his family, life went on with an almost defiant normalcy. He married a girl from a neighboring county, had children, and in time became a respected businessman, just like his father. Their name continued to be synonymous with power and influence. They attended church on Sundays, donated to local causes, and held their heads high. They had proven their point. They were the law in these mountains, and their honor was worth more than a young woman's life. Their victory was total. They had not only silenced June Crabb, they had silenced justice itself. But the stories that have been passed down say that the victory was a hollow one. They say the young man, as he grew older, was haunted. Not by a ghost in white, but by something far worse, a perfect, unending memory. He took to drinking heavily, and his temper, which had always been a spark, became a raging fire. People learned to give him a wide berth. He never, ever took the Fincastle Road again, even if it meant adding an hour to his journey. He lived a long life, but it was a life lived in a prison of his own making, forever looking over his shoulder, not for the law, but for the face of a girl he had left in a briar-choked hollow on Clinch Mountain. The community, too, lived under that long shadow. They knew the truth. Every man, woman, and child knew who had done it, and they knew why nothing was ever done. The case of June Crabb became a quiet, bitter lesson in the two kinds of justice that existed in the mountains, one for the common folk and another for the powerful. It bred a deep and lasting distrust that soured relationships for a generation. Justice had been denied, but memory is a different kind of court, and in the minds of the people of Scott County, the verdict was never in doubt. To this day, the murder of June Crabb isn't a settled piece of history around here. It's a living wound, and if you try to touch it, you'll find it's still tender. The story has fractured over the decades, becoming a testament to the fact that the past is never really dead. Depending on which family you ask, you will get two starkly different, irreconcilable versions of the truth. Ask anyone whose family has been in these hills for a century, especially those with a connection to the Crabb family, and they'll tell you the story I've just told. They'll speak of June as a bright light, a symbol of innocence who was sacrificed on the altar of a powerful family's pride. To them, the case is a defining local tragedy, a story of an unforgivable crime compounded by an unforgivable cover-up. It is a cautionary tale about how money and influence can poison the very soul of a community and place a family above the law. In this version, the guilt is absolute, the injustice is clear, and the memory of June is that of a martyr. But there are still a few who hold to a different telling. If you could find a descendant of that other family, and if they would even speak to you about it, they would tell you a tale of slander. They'd say their ancestor was a good, hard-working man, and that his family's success bred jealousy and vicious rumors. They would dismiss the story of the church social as malicious gossip, a tale spun by lesser men to tear down their betters. They would point to the official record, to the sheriff's tireless hunt for a nameless tramp, as the real truth. In their version, their family is the victim, unfairly maligned for generations by a lie that took root and grew into an unkillable weed. And there you have it. Two stories, two histories, occupying the same small patch of earth. One is a story of absolute guilt, preserved in the whispers of generations of ordinary people. The other is a story of absolute innocence, preserved by a family's defiant pride and backed by the clean, empty pages of the official record. The real, objective truth of what happened in that hollow probably died with the last person who was there. What we're left with are conflicting legacies. It's no longer just a question of what happened. It's a question of who you believe, and the answer says as much about you as it does about the past. When official justice fails in a place this isolated, the people find their own way to keep the truth alive. The story doesn't die. It just changes form. It escapes the dry, dusty pages of the official record and seeps into the local folklore. The hard edges of fact begin to soften and blur, and slowly, surely, a true crime story transforms into a full-blown Appalachian legend. Ask around today about June Crab, and some of the old-timers will tell you about the ghost of Fincastle Road. They say if you drive that lonely stretch of pavement late on a September evening, just as the fog is starting to settle in the hollows, you should watch the shoulder of the road carefully. They say you might see her, a figure in a simple dress, her face pale in the headlights, forever walking that final mile, trying to get home. Some even claim to have heard a single terrified cry carried on the wind, a sound that the mountains swallowed once and have been echoing ever since. But more than just a ghost story, her tragedy became a cautionary tale, a lesson whispered from mothers to daughters for generations. Her name became a warning about the dangers that can hide behind a neighbor's smile, a warning about the deadly fragility of a powerful man's pride. Her murder was no longer just a singular event. It was a living piece of folklore, a map of the hidden dangers that lay beneath the serene surface of their world, a brutal reminder that civilization is sometimes just a thin veneer stretched over something much older and wilder. This is the final stage of a story's life. It's how a community holds on to a truth that was officially denied. They turn the unbearable facts of history into the enduring power of a legend. The names of the guilty men might be spoken only in hushed tones, but the spirit of the story, the ghost of it, remains forever a part of the landscape, a permanent chill in the air on an otherwise quiet country road. So we find ourselves back where we started, on the side of this quiet, lonely road. The sun is lower now, casting long shadows that stretch across the asphalt like dark fingers. But it's not the same place it was when we began this journey. An hour ago, this was just a stretch of road. Now, it's a stage. The trees are the silent witnesses. The wind in the leaves carries the whispers of a story that this place has held for nearly a century. A story of a bright life ended and a dark secret kept. We went looking for the truth of what happened to June Crab, and we found it. Not in the official reports, but in the memories passed down through generations, in the cold logic of the landscape, and in the glaring empty spaces within the official record. We pieced it together, from the crushed hat on the floorboard to the two graves resting on the same hill. That's the power of these forgotten corners of the world. The next time you drive past a crumbling stone chimney standing alone in a field, or see a forgotten cemetery being slowly reclaimed by the forest, remember this. They aren't just empty spaces. They are libraries filled with the stories of the people who came before us, stories of love, pride, and the terrible choices that can echo forever. The Ford coupe has long since turned to rust. The men who did this and the men who covered it up are nothing more than dust and names on a family tree. Everything from that terrible September afternoon is gone. The people are gone. The evidence is gone. But the story remains. They say that on the day they strapped Floyd Allen into the electric chair, the mountains of Carroll County held their breath. Here was a man who had been a law unto himself, a patriarch whose word was gospel and whose pistol was the final court of appeal. He was a king in his own world, a world of misty hollers and unwritten codes of honor. Yet his reign ended not in a blaze of glory on a mountainside, but in a sterile room in Richmond, at the hands of a power he could never understand. Was he the last of the mountain lions, a fierce protector of his kin, cornered by a world that no longer had a place for him? Or was he a brutal tyrant, a man whose pride was so vast it consumed everything he loved, his family, his fortune, and finally, his own life? The truth, as it always does in these old hills, is tangled up like roots in the clay. Today, we're going to untangle that story. We're going to follow the trail of blood and honor that led Floyd Allen from the pinnacle of power in his mountain kingdom to that cold chair in the state penitentiary. And to do that, we have to start not with the famous massacre that sealed his fate, but with the forgotten gunfight 4 years earlier, the day the Allens shot up a courthouse and walked away, convinced they were invincible. Floyd Allen was not born a killer. He was born a king. His kingdom was the mist-shrouded hills and dark, winding hollows of Carroll County, Virginia, a world forged in the cold creeks and rocky soil of the Blue Ridge. In the late 19th century, this wasn't just a place on a map. It was a fortress of self-reliance, sealed off from the outside world by poor roads and a deep-seated suspicion of flatlanders and their laws. Here, a man's name was his legacy, and the Allen name carried the weight of generations of hard work, hard-headedness, and a fierce, unyielding loyalty to their own. His father, and his father before him, had taught him the only lessons that mattered. You didn't learn your worth in a schoolhouse. You learned it behind a plow, with an axe in your hand, or by looking another man in the eye during a land deal. The Allens were not poor. They were landowners, farmers, and businessmen who built their prosperity with their own sweat and ingenuity. Floyd learned early that wealth and influence were earned, and once earned, they had to be defended. Not with lawyers and contracts, but with a firm handshake for a friend and a cold stare for an enemy. Life in those mountains was a constant struggle, a teacher of hard truths. A failed crop could mean a hungry winter. A sudden sickness could be a death sentence without a doctor for miles. You learned to depend on two things, your own strength and the strength of your kin. When a neighbor's barn burned, it wasn't the government that showed up to help, it was the community. And when trouble came looking for you, it wasn't a sheriff you called, it was your brothers and your cousins. This forged an unbreakable bond within the clan and a permanent wall against the outside world, which they saw as weak, meddlesome, and utterly untrustworthy. There's an old story, perhaps a legend, about a young Floyd Allen watching his father deal with a dispute over a timber boundary. A man from outside the county arrived with a deed from the courthouse in Richmond, waving the paper as if it were a holy scripture. He claimed the Allens had been cutting on his land. Floyd's father didn't even look at the document. He just looked at the man and said, "I know my line, and you know my line. That paper doesn't know this mountain." He stood his ground, unblinking, until the man with the deed folded it up, and left. The lesson for young Floyd was seared into his soul. A man's spine was worth more than his signature, and the only true law was the one a man was willing to enforce himself. From this upbringing, Floyd Allen carried with him a code as rigid and unforgiving as the mountains themselves. First, your blood was your nation. An offense against one Allen was a declaration of war on them all. Second, your honor was your most valuable possession. An insult left unanswered was a stain that could never be washed away. Third, you stood on your own 2 feet. You solved your own problems, you fought your own battles, and you never, ever bowed your head to an outsider trying to tell you how to live on your own land. This was the world that created Floyd Allen, and he, in turn, became its perfect embodiment. He was industrious, proud, and quick to anger, but he was also known for his generosity and unwavering loyalty to those he considered his own. He wasn't just a man living by the mountain code, he was the mountain code, walking and breathing. And he was walking straight toward a collision with a modern world that had no room for kings like him. Long before the newspapers in Richmond painted him as a monster, Floyd Allen was simply the most important man in his corner of the world. He was a man built like a barrel, solid and immovable, with eyes that could measure a man's worth in a single glance. When he walked into a room, the conversation didn't stop, but it changed. People straightened up. They knew they were in the presence of someone who mattered, a man whose favor could make you and whose anger could break you. He wasn't just a farmer scratching a living from the dirt. He was an empire builder in miniature. He owned some of the best land in Carroll County, acres of it, cleared and farmed with meticulous care. He ran a general store that was the hub of the community, a place where news was traded over barrels of crackers and bolts of cloth. He was a shrewd businessman who always seemed to be one step ahead, whether he was buying timber, trading livestock, or, as some whispered, running a profitable line in the untaxed corn liquor that warmed the mountain winters. He had built a small fortune through grit and intelligence, and he provided well for his own. But his influence went far beyond money. Floyd Allen was the unofficial law in his part of the county. If a dispute arose between neighbors over a stray cow or a poorly marked property line, more often than not, they wouldn't ride to the courthouse in Hillsville. They'd ride to Floyd Allen's porch. He would listen to both sides, his face unreadable, and then he would deliver his verdict. And his verdict was final. There was no appeal because everyone knew Floyd Allen had the will and the means to enforce his own judgments. To many, this wasn't tyranny. It was justice, swift, understandable, and delivered by one of their own. To truly understand the man, though, you have to look past the businessman and the enforcer. You have to see him at his own dinner table, surrounded by his wife and children, his brothers and their families. Here, the hard gaze softened. He was the undisputed patriarch, the head of the clan, but his rule was built on a foundation of fierce, protective love. His family was his fortress, the living, breathing heart of the world he had built. Every acre he bought, every dollar he earned, every enemy he made, it was all in service of protecting them. He was the sentinel on the walls of that fortress. This was the world Floyd Allen had built, a self-contained kingdom carved out of the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was a world of order, his order, built on loyalty, respect, and the quiet understanding that his authority was absolute. It was a peaceful kingdom, a safe harbor for his kin, and he would do absolutely anything to protect it from the encroaching world he saw as a threat to everything he held dear. But for all his strength, for all the respect he commanded, Floyd Allen was a man with a crack in his foundation. It was a flaw as deep and as unyielding as the mountain granite itself, a pride so absolute, so all-consuming, that it bordered on a kind of personal sovereignty. He didn't just think he was right. He believed in his bones that his will was the only true law. This wasn't simple arrogance. It was the conviction of a king who genuinely could not comprehend any authority higher than his own. They tell a story in Carroll County about a revenue agent who came up from Richmond one year, a young man full of ink and importance, carrying a list of new taxes. He found Floyd on his porch and began to explain the new regulations in a condescending tone, as if speaking to a simple child of the hills. Floyd listened patiently, his face a mask. When the agent was finished, Floyd didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked at the man and said, "Your papers have no meaning on this land. You can take them, and yourself, back down the mountain you came up." The agent tried to protest, to invoke the power of the state, but he saw something in Floyd Allen's eyes that told him the conversation was over. That kind of pride, that unshakable belief in his own domain, was a force of nature. For years, this very flaw had been his greatest strength. It was pride that drove him to outwork every man around him, to turn rocky fields into profitable farms. It was pride that made him a man of his word, because the thought of his reputation being tarnished was intolerable. It was the source of the fierce loyalty he showed his kin. An insult to them was an insult to him, and his pride would not let that stand. He built his entire world on the principle of never backing down, never bending a knee. But this strength cast a long and dangerous shadow. It made him utterly blind to the changing world. He saw every legal summons, every warrant, every tax notice, not as the impersonal functioning of a government, but as a direct and personal challenge to his honor from a rival power. He couldn't distinguish between a man who insulted his family and a judge who issued a lawful order. To Floyd Allen, they were one and the same, an outside force trying to impose its will on his kingdom. This inability to bend, this refusal to acknowledge any law but his own, was a tragic flaw of classical proportions. It was a ticking clock, counting down to a day when he would be faced with a choice he was incapable of making. A day when the state would demand he submit, and his pride would demand he resist. A confrontation was not just likely, it was written in the very soul of the man. And that confrontation would be the engine of the entire tragedy to come. The spark that would eventually burn down the Allen dynasty was not some grand crime, no bloody murder or daring robbery. It was a piece of paper, a simple indictment from the Grayson County Court. The target wasn't even Floyd, but his brother, Sidney Allen, a man as proud and respected as any in the clan. The charge? Carrying a concealed weapon. To the state of Virginia, it was a misdemeanor. To the Allens, it was like charging a blacksmith for owning a hammer. In their world, a pistol was a tool of survival and a symbol of manhood, and the law had no business telling a free man what he could or could not carry. But this was more than a dispute over a law. It was personal. The Allens had been in a long, simmering feud with the local deputy, Mabe Poole. They saw his hand in this, believing the badge was being used as a weapon to settle old scores and chip away at their influence. The arrest of Sidney was not seen as impartial justice. It was seen as targeted harassment by their enemies. To Floyd Allen, this summons wasn't a legal document. It was a glove slapped across his face, a public challenge to his family's honor and his own authority as the clan's protector. His pride, that immense and fragile thing, could not let such a public effrontery stand. There was no talk of hiring a fancy lawyer from Richmond. The Allens' response was primal and immediate. They would answer the summons, but on their own terms. On the day of the trial in 1908, a formidable delegation of the Allen clan rode into the town of Independence. They weren't coming to plead for mercy. They were coming to make a statement. Floyd, Sidney, and their hot-headed young nephew Wesley Edwards led the way. They were armed, their faces were grim, and they moved with the cold confidence of men who believed they were their own highest law. The courtroom itself became a stage for this clash of worlds. On one side sat Judge Thornton Massey, the Commonwealth's attorney, and the handful of deputies who represented the fragile authority of the state. On the other, the Allens sat together, a silent, unmoving block of defiance. They were an island of mountain code in an ocean of common law. The air was thick with tension, heavy with the unspoken knowledge that the legal proceedings were just a formality, a prelude to a confrontation that had been brewing for years. The trial was a quick affair. The verdict came back as everyone expected: guilty. When that word echoed through the courtroom, it was more than a legal finding. It was a declaration of victory by the state over the clan. It was the law of the flatlands telling Floyd Allen, in his own territory, that his power meant nothing within these four walls. For a man whose entire identity was built on never backing down, on being the ultimate authority, this public humiliation was the unforgivable affront. It was the point of no return. The time for talk was over. In the heavy silence that followed the verdict, the world seemed to shrink to the four walls of that courtroom. For any other man, this was the moment to negotiate, to mitigate, to swallow his pride and pay the fine. A quiet word from a lawyer, a nod of acceptance to the judge, these were the off-ramps back to a peaceful life. The court itself offered these paths. Judge Massey was known to be a reasonable man. The sentence for a first offense of this nature would likely have been little more than a token fine, a slap on the wrist to assert the law's authority. But Floyd Allen did not see a row of open doors. He saw a line of bayonets. Every aspect of the legal process was, in his eyes, another link in a chain being forged to bind him. The clerk's scratching pen, the jury's averted eyes, the judge's solemn face, these were not instruments of justice, but weapons of humiliation. You could see it in the set of his jaw, in the way his gaze never left the judge's bench. He was not a defendant awaiting a sentence. He was a king staring down a usurper. Some accounts say that even Sidney Allen, the man at the center of it all, hesitated. He was a practical man, and perhaps he saw the futility of this confrontation. A fine was just money after all. A few days in jail would be an inconvenience, not the end of the world. He might have been willing to bend, to give the law its small victory and live to fight another day. But he, like everyone else in the Allen clan, looked to Floyd. And Floyd's face was carved from stone. His pride had taken the wheel, and it recognized no road but the one that led straight ahead. The young men, especially the hot-blooded Wesley Edwards, took their cue from the patriarch. They saw his unyielding stance not as stubbornness, but as courage. They saw his cold fury as righteous anger. Floyd's rejection of compromise was a silent command to them all. We do not break. We do not bow. If Floyd Allen had shown the slightest sign of submission, his kin would have followed. But he showed none. His decision, made in the silent furnace of his own pride, sealed the fate of everyone in that room. Each tick of the clock was a step further down the path of no return. The opportunity for a quiet resolution vanished. The chance for a grudging acceptance evaporated. The air grew thinner, charged with an invisible current of violence. The Allens were no longer just a family in legal trouble. They had become a powder keg, and Floyd Allen's pride was the lit fuse. By refusing to accept the court's authority, he had rejected all possibility of peace. He had made his choice, not with words, but with a glare of pure, undiluted defiance. He had decided that the Allen law was the only law that mattered, and he was prepared to prove it. The moment the guilty verdict was read, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the courtroom. This was it, the final crossroads. All that stood between the Allen clan and open warfare was the sentence from Judge Thornton Massey. And in that moment, the judge, perhaps sensing the electric tension in the room, seemed to extend one last fragile bridge back to the world of reason. He rapped his gavel once, a sound like a cracking bone, and prepared to speak. He could have thrown the book at Sidney Allen. He could have imposed a heavy fine and a long jail sentence to make an example of him. But instead, the words he spoke were measured, designed to de-escalate. He pronounced the sentence, a fine and a short term in the county jail. Some accounts even claim the jail time was suspended. It was a token punishment, a symbolic victory for the state that would allow the Allens to pay a pittance and walk away with their freedom intact. It was the law's final, surprisingly fair offer. It was the last chance for peace. For a long, agonizing second, that offer hung in the air. The whole world seemed to pause, waiting on one man. Everyone, from the nervous deputies to the Allens themselves, turned their eyes to Floyd. He didn't have to say a word. His face was the weather vane that would show which way the storm would break. He could have reached into his pocket, pulled out a few bills, and ended the whole affair. He could have swallowed his pride just for a moment and saved everything. It was the logical choice, the sane choice. But as Floyd Allen stood there, he wasn't weighing a fine against his freedom. He was weighing submission against his very soul. In his mind, paying that fine was no different than kneeling before a conquering king. It was an admission that the law of the courthouse was stronger than the law of the clan. It was a public branding of his family as subservient. And his pride, that fierce and terrible master, screamed that death was better than such a dishonor. And so, in that final moment, he made his choice. He didn't shout or draw his weapon. The signal was far more chilling. He met the eyes of his nephew, the volatile Wesley Edwards, and gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head. It was a silent, final verdict, delivered not by the judge, but by the patriarch. The verdict was war. The last door to peace had just been slammed shut and locked from the inside. As Judge Massey's words faded, the air in the courtroom became as thin as a winter razor. Then, from the Allen side of the room, a chair scraped violently against the floorboards. Young Wesley Edwards was on his feet, his face a mask of pure fury. His voice, cracking with youthful rage, cut through the tension like a thrown knife. "I'll see you in hell," he roared, "before Sidney Allen goes to jail." It was not a plea or a threat. It was a declaration of war. In that instant, the world for Floyd Allen slowed to a crawl. He saw a deputy, Mabe Poole or another man like him, take a single fateful step towards Sidney. It was a small movement, but in the supercharged atmosphere of the room, it was an act of aggression, a hand reaching out to put a chain on a king. The sound of his own heart hammered in his ears, a deep, steady drumbeat counting down the final seconds of peace. His hand, as if with a mind of its own, found the familiar cold weight of the pistol under his coat. A single sharp crack shattered the stillness. It wasn't a boom, but a sound as clean and final as a closing coffin lid. For a heartbeat, there was only the ringing echo. Then the courtroom exploded. It was a deafening, blinding chaos. Blinks of orange fire lit the suddenly dim room as more shots answered the first. The air filled with a thick, choking grey smoke from the black powder, smelling of sulfur and damnation. Women screamed, a high, thin sound that was quickly swallowed by the deeper roar of men's shouts and the splintering of wood as heavy benches overturned. Through the swirling smoke, the world was a series of terrifying snapshots. Judge Massey, the very symbol of the law, vanished from his high bench as if swallowed by the earth, scrambling for cover. Men who had moments before been instruments of the state were now just men, diving behind tables, their faces pale with shock. The courtroom, a temple of order, had been transformed into a smoky, claustrophobic battlefield where survival was the only law left. But the Allens were not panicking. They were a single organism, moving with a cold, terrifying purpose. They rose as one, not to flee, but to fight their way out. They formed a bristling line of steel and defiance, a human wall that no one dared to cross. Each man covered the other, their movements honed by a lifetime of absolute trust. They were not a mob, they were a clan. And in that moment of pure violence, they were magnificent and terrible. The few deputies in the room were outmanned, outgunned, and utterly outmatched by this unified front of cold fury. The storm of noise lasted for what felt like an eternity, but it was likely only a minute. As quickly as it began, it subsided. The last shot echoed, and a profound, ringing silence descended upon the room. The air was a thick, unbreathable fog, heavy with the metallic tang of burnt powder. The argument that had started with a piece of paper was suddenly, permanently over. Through the haze, Floyd Allen saw the wreckage of the law's authority, and he knew they had won. The thick grey smoke began to clear, not on a scene of carnage, but on a scene of absolute victory. Floyd Allen stood amidst the overturned benches and the lingering smell of gunpowder, his pistol still warm in his hand. He felt no remorse. Remorse was for men who made mistakes. He had made a choice, and he had enforced his will. He looked at his kin, Sydnor, Wesley, the others, their faces smeared with soot, their eyes alight with the fire of battle. They were shaken, but unbroken. They were Allens. There was no thought of surrender, no consideration of waiting for the law to regroup. That would be admitting they had done something wrong. In Floyd's mind, they had done the only thing they could. He gave a sharp, curt nod to his brother. It was time to go. The business in this place was finished. They didn't run, they walked. With a slow, deliberate pace, the Allen clan strode out of the ruined courtroom, a phalanx of armed and dangerous men. Deputies and court officials, still dazed and disarmed by the suddenness of the assault, simply watched them go. No one dared to raise a hand to stop them. They moved through the panicked corridors and down the courthouse steps into the daylight, emerging into the gaping faces of the townsfolk who had gathered at the sound of the gunfire. Their path through the town of Independence was a corridor of fear and awe. People flattened themselves against walls, pulling their children back. The lawmen who were supposed to be the guardians of this town were nowhere to be seen, or they stood by, powerless and humiliated. The Allens walked straight to their horses, which were tied to a hitching post as if it were any other market day. There was no haste in their movements. They checked their saddles, mounted their horses, and gathered together in the middle of the street. For a final moment, Floyd Allen looked back at the courthouse, the symbol of the flatland law he so despised. It stood there, violated and silent. He had challenged it on its own ground, and he had won. He turned his horse without a word, and together the Allens rode out of town, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled back down on the defeated law. They were not fugitives fleeing into the wilderness. They were conquerors, returning to their mountain kingdom. The Allens rode home as heroes, their victory echoing through the hollows before they even reached their own land. To their kin and supporters, they were giants who had stared down the corrupt machinery of ink. But this triumph was a poisoned chalice. While the men celebrated their defiance, the women of the clan now had to live with a new and constant dread. They had seen their husbands and sons ride off to a courthouse and return from a gunfight. From that day forward, every trip to town, every knock on the door, would carry the chilling possibility of reprisal. The victory at Independence didn't bring peace. It brought a permanent state of war. The community itself was fractured. You see, an event like this forces everyone to choose a side. There was no longer any middle ground. Families who had been neighbors for generations suddenly looked at each other with suspicion. You were either with the Allens and the old ways, or you were with the law and the future. Friendships soured, and old resentments flared into open hostility. The Commonwealth's attorney, Greer, nursed more than just a bullet wound in his arm. He nursed a grudge that would fester for years. The law had been publicly humiliated, and men like that have long memories. But the most dangerous ripple effect was on the law itself. Judge Thornton Massey was not a man to be cowed. The bullets that had scarred his courtroom had also hardened his resolve. The Allens had proven they were not just a difficult family, they were an armed insurrection against the very idea of a civilized society. For the judge and the prosecutors, the fight was no longer about a misdemeanor weapons charge. It was now an existential struggle for control of the mountains. They began to plan, to prepare, to ensure that the next time they faced the Allen clan in a courtroom, the state would not be the one to back down. The Allens' victory guaranteed that any future confrontation would be met with overwhelming force. The greatest wreckage, however, was invisible. It was the damage done to the minds of the next generation of Allens. The younger men, like Wesley Edwards, had learned a powerful and deadly lesson: that violence was a successful political tool. They had seen with their own eyes that a drawn pistol was more effective than any lawyer. This victory bred a fatal arrogance, a belief in their own invincibility. It erased any lingering respect for the institutions of the state and replaced it with contempt. They had shot their way out of trouble once, and now they believed they could do it again. So while Floyd Allen may have seen the events at never truly cleared, it settled like a fine, toxic dust over the entire county, poisoning relationships, hardening hearts, and laying the groundwork for a far bloodier reckoning. The real tragedy of 1908 wasn't the gunfight itself, but the terrible future it made inevitable for everyone involved. After the Allens rode out of Independence, a strange and telling silence fell. There was no thundering posse, no call for the militia, no immediate cry for vengeance from the state. The reason was simple and stark. The local law enforcement had been completely and utterly broken. They had been outfought and humiliated on their own ground. To ride into the Allens' territory in the mountains of Carroll County would not have been a police action. It would have been a declaration of war, a war they knew they could not win. The law's first judgment, therefore, was a judgment of its own weakness. And so, the official trial of the Allen clan never truly happened. Instead, there was a series of quiet, face-saving maneuvers in back rooms. Warrants may have been issued, but they gathered dust. The Commonwealth's attorney, Mr. Greer, knew that serving them would cost more lives. In the end, the system blinked. The charges stemming from the riot were quietly dropped or settled with a small fine, likely paid by a third party, so that no Allen would have to suffer the indignity of paying it themselves. It was a humiliating whisper of a conclusion to a day that had roared with gunfire. The law, in essence, pretended it never happened. But in the court of public opinion, the verdict was split right down the middle, cleaving the community in two. To the people of the mountains, to the families who lived by the same unwritten code, the Allens were heroes. They were seen as men who had refused to be harassed, who had defended their honor against a corrupt and alien system. The story of their victory was told around hearths and in general stores, growing more legendary with each telling. In this version, they were not criminals. They were martyrs to the cause of mountain independence. To the townspeople, the merchants, the lawyers, and the families connected to the court, the verdict was just as clear, but entirely different. To them, the Allens were savages. They were domestic terrorists who had desecrated the most sacred institution of civil society. They had replaced reasoned debate with brute force and the rule of law with the law of the gun. These people saw the Allens not as proud men, but as dangerous anarchists whose power had to be destroyed if the county was ever to move into the modern world. So, was justice served? By the standards of the state, the law had been challenged by force and had retreated in disgrace. But by the standards of the mountain code, justice had been served perfectly. An insult had been answered, honor had been satisfied, and the clan's authority had been reinforced. The true verdict on the independence riot wasn't handed down by a judge or a jury. It was a verdict written in gunpowder and fear, and it declared for all the world to see that in these mountains the Allen Code was still the supreme law of the land. What of the men who stood for the law that day? What became of the antagonists in this story? In the immediate aftermath, their fate was one of profound and public humiliation. Judge Thornton Massey had been forced to take cover behind his own bench. Commonwealth's Attorney Greer had been wounded. The deputies of Grayson County had been rendered utterly impotent, forced to watch as a gang of men shot up their courthouse and rode away untouched. For them, there was no justice, only the bitter taste of defeat. But if the Allens believed they had broken these men, they had made a grave miscalculation. They had not broken them. They had forged them into something harder and far more dangerous. Judge Massey did not resign or transfer to a quieter circuit. He stayed. The bullet holes in his courtroom were a daily reminder of the day his authority was shattered by gunfire. The experience didn't fill him with fear, it filled him with an iron resolve. For him, this was no longer a matter of law. It became a personal crusade to prove that the code of the courthouse was stronger than the code of the clan. He would get his chance 4 years later in a different courtroom facing the same family. The other players in this drama were similarly hardened. Greer's wounded arm eventually healed, but the insult to his office never did. The deputies who had been so easily overpowered learned a critical lesson. You do not bring a handful of men to a fight with the Allen clan. The entire legal establishment of the region, from sheriffs to prosecutors, understood that the next confrontation could not be a simple legal proceeding. It would have to be a show of overwhelming force. And so, the antagonists in this story did not meet some poetic justice. They did not wither away or disappear. Instead, they prospered and they planned. The Allens' victory and independence was the single greatest catalyst for their own destruction, because it united all their enemies and gave them a common cause. They had won the battle, but in doing so, they had awakened a sleeping giant. The law had been bloodied, but now it was awake, and it was watching, and it was waiting for the one mistake that would give it the chance to settle the score once and for all. The 4 years that followed the independence riot were the high summer of the Allen clan's power. Their victory didn't just fade into memory, it became the foundation of their living legend. Floyd Allen's authority, already immense, became absolute. His name was spoken with a mixture of fear and reverence from one end of the county to the other. His porch was no longer just a place of business, it was a throne room. In this brief, tense period, the Allens were not just a powerful family, they were royalty, and their mountain kingdom had never seemed more secure. But this victory planted poison seeds in the next generation. For the young men of the clan, the sons and nephews who looked up to Floyd, the riot was their defining lesson. They saw that the law could be faced down, that pistols spoke louder than gavels. They carried themselves with a new swagger, an unshakable arrogance born from the belief that they were untouchable. This sense of impunity would prove to be a fatal inheritance. The shadow of their family name, which had once been a shield, was slowly transforming into a target. The community did not heal. It curdled. The riot had been a political earthquake, and the fault line ran straight through the heart of the county. The old, easygoing relationships between neighbors were replaced by a quiet, watchful tension. People were careful about what they said and who they said it to. You were either a friend of the Allens or you were an enemy, and everyone knew that being their enemy was a dangerous proposition. The county wasn't rebuilding. It was holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The silence in those hills wasn't peace. It was the quiet of a long, drawn-out ceasefire. And while the Allens reigned supreme in their hollows, a consolidating in the towns, the court, the sheriff's department, the Commonwealth's attorney, they had been humiliated, but they had not been broken. They were learning, adapting, and waiting. The power dynamic in the region had shifted into a precarious and deadly balance. On one side was the visible personal power of a clan patriarch. On the other was the slow, patient, and institutional power of the state. Both sides believed they were right, and both were now utterly convinced that the other could only be dealt with through force. The stage was being set for a final, tragic resolution. Today, the town of Independence is quiet. The old Grayson County Courthouse still stands, a stately brick building that keeps its secrets well. People walk its halls on county business, footsteps echoing where Wesley Edwards once roared his defiance. Tourists might admire its architecture, never knowing they're standing on a battlefield where the law of the state and the law of the clan met in a blaze of gunfire. But if you stand there long enough, on a quiet afternoon, you can almost feel it, a faint, lingering echo of the chaos, the ghost of a moment when this temple of order was consumed by pure, unadulterated mountain rage. If you know where to look, you can find the other physical remnants of this story scattered across the hills. The old Allen homesteads are long gone. The cabins collapsed and reclaimed by ivy and rhododendron, leaving only a few tumble-down chimney stacks standing like lonely tombstones in the woods. And in a quiet cemetery, place of Floyd Allen himself, The name on the weathered stone is simple, giving no hint of the storm that was his life. Here lies the king whose kingdom turned to dust, a silent testament to the fact that no man, no matter how powerful, can hold back the tide of the world forever. But the true legacy of the Allens isn't carved in stone or preserved in brick. It lives in the stories. The tale of the Independence Riot and the more famous Hillsville Massacre that followed has been worn smooth by a century of telling, transformed from a raw news event into a piece of local folklore. It's a cautionary tale told to hot-headed young men about the dangers of pride. It's a ballad of defiance sung by those who still feel a kinship with the old ways. Depending on who you ask, Floyd Allen is either a cold-blooded killer who got what he deserved, or a tragic fast king of the mountains. The man is gone. The clan's power is broken. But their spirit, that fierce, uncompromising and violent spirit of the old Blue Ridge, has not vanished completely. It haunts these mountains still. You can hear it in the stories told on front porches as the evening mist settles in the hollows. You can feel it in the deep-seated distrust of authority that still lingers in the hearts of some. Floyd Allen is dead, but the ghost of his name and what it stood for remains a stubborn whisper in the wind. So we come back to the question we started with, the one they still ask in the quiet corners of these mountains. Was Floyd Allen a hero or a villain? The truth is, he was both, and he was neither. He was a hero by the code of a world that was already dying, a world where a man's honor was his own to defend. By that ancient law, he was a righteous king protecting his domain. But he was a villain to the new world that was being born, a world of statutes and courtrooms that had no room for kings. His tragedy was not that he was evil, but that he was born a century too late. In the end, the Ballad of Floyd Allen isn't just a tale of mountain justice and courtroom gunsmoke. It's a profound and timeless story about how a man's greatest strength can become the very engine of his destruction. That unbending, iron-willed pride was the forge that created him. It made him a leader, a provider, and a protector. But that same pride blinded him to the changing world, and it would not allow him to bend, even when breaking was the only other choice. His story is a warning, etched in blood and gunpowder, that no man can stand alone against the turning of the tides. You cannot fight the future with a pistol, and you cannot hold back the world with the force of your will alone. And that, my friends, is the ballad of a man who tried to be as unmovable as the mountains themselves, only to discover that even the mountains, given enough time, must crumble into dust. When the gunsmoke cleared over the Tug Fork River, one Hatfield lay dead on the ferry landing, put there by another. The killer wasn't some long-hated McCoy. He was the law itself, Sheriff Bud Hatfield, and the man bleeding out in the dirt was his own cousin. This single act raises a chilling question that echoes through the hollows to this day. How does a man forged in the fires of the Hatfield feud, a clan that valued blood above all else, bring himself to kill his own family for a tin star? The newspapers of the day called it justice. But those who lived in the shadows of the mountains whispered a different story, a story of a kinslayer, a man who made a deal with the devil, a traitor who sold his soul. Today, we will separate the facts from the folklore to find the truth behind the most feared and complicated lawman in Appalachian history. To understand the man, you have to understand the silence that fell after the storm. By the turn of the 20th century, the great Hatfield-McCoy feud was over. The shooting had mostly stopped. The famous raids were now just stories told to wide-eyed children. But the peace was a fragile, wounded thing. It was a land of long memories and short tempers, where a man's last name was more important than any law written in a book. The Tug Fork Valley was a world unto itself, a labyrinth of creeks and hollows where families lived by codes carved into their very bones over generations. Justice wasn't found in a courthouse. It was settled in a cornfield, on a riverbank, or at the dark end of a lonely mountain path. In this world of simmering grudges lived William, known to all as Bud. He was not a patriarch like his famous cousin, Devil Anse. He was a younger man, molded by the feud's final bloody years. He had seen the cost of hot-blooded pride firsthand. While his kin were known for their booming laughs and explosive tempers, Bud was different. He was quiet, watchful. He moved through the woods not like a man, but like a shadow, his eyes missing nothing. He didn't boast of his skill with a pistol. He simply practiced, hour after hour, until the Colt revolver felt like an extension of his own hand. He learned the mountains as a hunter, but he wasn't just tracking deer. He was learning how men think when they're being hunted, where they hide when they're scared, and the fatal mistakes they make when they believe they're safe. He was absorbing the brutal lessons of the feud, not as a brawler, but as a student of violence. He was a weapon being forged in the quiet aftermath of a war, waiting for a purpose. His world was one of clan loyalty, where the only thing that mattered was protecting your own, no matter the cost. But a new sound was beginning to echo through the mountains, a sound louder than a rifle shot. It was the chugging of steam engines and the grinding of machinery. Coal companies with their fat checkbooks and their armies of private detectives from agencies like Baldwin Felts were pushing their way into the hills. They saw the mountains not as a home, but as a treasure chest to be cracked open. They brought with them a new kind of law, corporate law, and they had no patience for the old ways of the clans. The world that had created Bud Hatfield was about to be devoured, and he would soon have to make a choice that no Hatfield had ever faced. The conflict that would define Bud Hatfield's life didn't begin with a single gunshot. Its seeds were planted generations before, deep in the rocky Appalachian soil. The Hatfields, like many of the Scots-Irish families who first dared to cross the mountains, carved a kingdom for themselves, not with a pen and a deed, but with an axe and a long rifle. This land wasn't just property. It was their lifeblood, their fortress, and their identity. They owed allegiance to no distant government. They were kings of their own hollows, and they held their land with a fierce, possessive grip that outsiders could never understand. The deepest scar on this landscape was the Civil War. While the nation tore itself apart, the borderlands between West Virginia and Kentucky became a brutal theater of guerrilla warfare. The Hatfields were fiercely Confederate, seeing the Union as an invading force trying to impose its will upon them. Devil Anse himself led a band of irregulars, the Logan Wildcats, who fought a vicious war in the hills long after the main armies had gone home. They weren't just fighting for a political cause. They were fighting for their own sovereignty against any and all outside control. This deep-seated division bled directly into the Hatfield-McCoy feud. At its heart, it was a continuation of the war on a more personal scale, with the largely Confederate Hatfields pitted against the largely Unionist McCoys. The conflict was fueled by old loyalties and betrayals that the rest of the country was trying to forget. For these families, the war never ended. It simply smoldered under the surface, waiting for any spark, a stolen pig, a forbidden romance, to erupt into a full-blown inferno. In this world, a family name was everything. It was a heavy cloak of obligation and pride worn from birth. And to be a Hatfield meant you lived by an unwritten, unbreakable code. It meant you stood by your kin, right or wrong. It meant you settled your own scores, answered insults with your fists or your gun, and never backed down from a fight. Above all, it meant you never, ever turned to an outside lawman for justice, and you certainly never became one. The law was the enemy, the outsider, the threat to the clan's power. This was the legacy Bud Hatfield was born into, a legacy of fierce independence, deep suspicion, and a sworn duty to put blood before all else. The end of the feud didn't bring unity. It left a vacuum. With no common enemy to fight, the old clans began to turn on themselves. The Tugfork Valley became a tangled web of personal slights and simmering resentments. The supporting cast wasn't just Hatfield and McCoy anymore. It was the Hatfields who sold timber rights to the coal companies versus the Hatfields who refused. It was the families who wanted schools and roads versus the families who saw every change as an invasion. It was a community teetering on a knife's edge, where everyone was watching everyone else, waiting for the first sign of weakness or betrayal. At the center of the old guard's resistance was Bud's own cousin, another Elias Hatfield, but this one went by a different name, Bad Lias. He was everything the old Hatfields were supposed to be, wild, violent, and utterly contemptuous of any law but his own. He drank, he brawled, and he took what he wanted. While Devil Anse was growing old and making calculated deals with the coal barons, Bad Lias was a living, breathing reminder of the clan's lawless past. He was a festering wound, a source of both pride and shame for the family, and his violent exploits kept the old animosities burning bright. The air itself grew thick with gossip. On the porch of the general store, men would speak in low tones about which Hatfield was seen talking to a Baldwin Felts man. Women would whisper over their washboards, speculating on who was behind a mysterious fire that burned a small logging operation. The McCoys and their allies, though quiet, were watching with hungry eyes. They saw the cracks forming in the great Hatfield dynasty and knew that a house divided against itself could not stand. Every fistfight, every land dispute, every drunken threat was fuel for a fire that had never truly been extinguished. This was a world where suspicion was a survival tool. A friendly wave from a man whose grandfather fought for the Union might be a genuine greeting, or it might be a trick to get a better look at the rifle you were carrying. A business deal gone sour wasn't a civil matter. It was a mortal insult that could lead to an ambush on a lonely stretch of road. It was a poison that seeped into the wells, turning neighbor against neighbor and cousin against cousin. The community wasn't healing. It was rotting from the inside out with paranoia and fear. And into this poisonous air, a new rumor began to spread, one more unbelievable than all the others. That Bud Hatfield, the quiet one, the dead shot, was thinking of doing the unthinkable. In the months before Bud Hatfield pinned on his badge, the old folks said the mountains themselves seemed to hold their breath. The air went still and heavy, the way it does before a lightning strike tears the sky open. A hoot owl, that feathered messenger of death, was heard crying in broad daylight near the Hatfield family graveyard. Men hunting deep in the woods came back with stories of feeling unseen eyes on their backs, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the bears or panthers that roamed the hills. The very land seemed to be sending a warning, whispering through the rustling leaves that the old world was dying and its ghost would not go peacefully. The human omen was far less subtle. Strangers began appearing in the hollows, men with clean hands and cold eyes, carrying surveyors' transits and leather briefcases full of contracts. They were the agents of the coal and timber companies, and they moved with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. They spoke of progress and prosperity, but their eyes measured the ancient trees in bored feet and sized up the family homesteads by the tons of coal that lay beneath them. Their presence was a constant, grating reminder that the outside world was no longer content to leave the mountains alone. They were a walking, talking prophecy of a new kind of war, one fought not with rifles over family honor, but with lawyers and hired guns over mineral rights. Bud Hatfield, a man who read the woods better than any book, felt this change in his gut. It was a coiled tightness in the air, a new kind of fear in the eyes of his neighbors. He saw men who had once been proud and defiant, now speaking in hushed tones, worried about losing the very land their grandfathers had bled for. He saw the easy smiles of the company men and recognized the look of a predator sizing up its prey. He felt a deep, chilling premonition that the old Hatfield code of settling their own problems and protecting their own kin was no longer enough. It was a code designed for fighting other mountain men, not for fighting a corporation with limitless money and its own private army. Something terrible was coming, and Bud knew, with the certainty of a hunter sensing a shift in the wind, that he was standing directly in its path. The law in Logan County had become a ghost. It haunted the courthouse, but it held no power in the hollows. The chaos that Bud Hatfield had foreseen was no longer a distant storm. It was a flood. Drunken brawls turned into shootouts in broad daylight. Payrolls for the coal mines were robbed on the open road. Witnesses to crimes would suddenly lose their memory, their silence bought by a quiet threat delivered on their doorstep in the dead of night. The old system of clan justice was crumbling, and the new corporate law of the Baldwin-Felts agents was nothing more than organized brutality, serving only the interests of the coal barons. The county was bleeding, and there was no one to stop it. It was in this desperate atmosphere that the county officials made their move. They needed a man who could not be intimidated, who knew the mountains and the mindset of the men who haunted them. They needed a man who was feared more than the outlaws themselves. And so, they came to the one man who fit that description perfectly. They came to Bud Hatfield. The offer was laid on the table, a deputy's badge. It wasn't a job offer, it was a plea. They weren't asking him to be a peacekeeper. They were asking him to be a hunter, a one-man army who could walk into the darkest hollows and drag the violence out into the light. For Bud, this was the moment the world stopped. To accept the badge was to turn his back on everything he had ever known. It was a declaration that the code of the Hatfields, the sacred bond of blood, was no longer his law. He was choosing the law of strangers over the blood of his grandfather. He looked at the chaos around him, at men like his cousin Bad Lears, who were becoming rabid dogs, and at the cold-eyed company thugs who were no better. He saw two paths leading to the same ruin, and in that moment he chose a third. With a steady hand, he reached out and took the small piece of tin. He pinned it to his chest. The word spread through the hollows like a pestilence. A Hatfield was the law. To his family, it was the ultimate betrayal. Whispers of traitor followed him like a shadow. Uncles and cousins who had known him since birth now looked at him with a mixture of fear and contempt. The community was instantly and violently divided. You were either for the old ways or you stood with the kinslayer. There was no middle ground. This was the first drop of blood. It wasn't spilled by a bullet, but by an oath. By pinning on that badge, Bud Hatfield had drawn a line not on a map, but through the heart of his own family. From that moment on, he was no longer just Bud Hatfield. He was Deputy Hatfield. And for men like his cousin, Bad Lears, who saw the badge as a declaration of war, it made him a target. The confrontation was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability. The confrontation was inevitable, and it happened, as so many things in that country do, by the river. Bud Hatfield and his posse cornered his cousin, Bad Lears, at the ferry landing. The water of the tug fork was slow and brown, the air thick with tension. It wasn't a long standoff. There were no grand speeches. There was only the low, steady voice of Sheriff Hatfield ordering his own blood to surrender, and the wild, defiant laugh of Bad Lears in response. For a moment, the two men stood as living symbols of the two worlds colliding, the old, lawless clan and the new, iron-willed law. What happened next took less time than a single breath, but the silence it created would last forever. There was no Hollywood gunfight, no men diving for cover. There was only a sudden, blurred movement, and then the calm was shattered by a deafening roar that echoed off the water and slammed into the hills. It was followed almost instantly by a second shot, so close to the first they sounded like a single stuttered clap of thunder. The posse froze, their own guns still in their holsters. When the sharp, acrid smell of gun smoke cut through the damp air, Bad Lears was no longer standing. He was on his knees, his head bowed, looking not at his cousin, but down at the wooden planks of the landing. He stayed that way for a single, long second, a statue of defeat. Then, without a sound, he simply pitched forward, his fall making a dull, hollow thud that seemed shockingly loud in the sudden quiet. From across the river, a person would have seen almost nothing. Just two men facing each other, a puff of white smoke quickly stolen by the breeze, and then one man falling. They would not have seen any blood. they would only have seen a dark stain begin to slowly spread across the back of the fallen man's shirt, like a shadow growing in the afternoon sun. The true horror wasn't in the wound, but in the stillness that followed. Bud Hatfield walked forward, his boots making heavy, deliberate sounds on the ferry landing. He stood over the body of his kinsman, his own pistol still smoking in his hand. The pearl handle, they say, felt as cold as a river stone against his palm. He did not speak. He did not offer a prayer. He simply looked down at what the law had required of him. Members of the posse would later whisper that the most terrifying part was the look in Sheriff Hatfield's eyes. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't remorse. It was a chilling, empty calm, the look of a man who had just performed a necessary but terrible piece of work. A Hatfield had killed a Hatfield. In that moment, the old world of clan justice didn't just die. It was executed on a riverbank by one of its own sons. To understand what went through Bud Hatfield's mind on that ferry landing, you must first understand that he likely didn't see himself as a killer. He saw himself as a surgeon. In his cold, calculated view, his cousin, Bad Lias, wasn't a man anymore. He was a disease. He was the living embodiment of the chaos and violence that was strangling the mountains, the very sickness that Bud had sworn an oath to cure. His twisted logic was terrifyingly simple. To save the body, you must cut out the cancer. In that moment, the bond of blood was meaningless. It was an old-world sentiment that had no place in the new order he was trying to build. He wasn't executing his cousin. He was executing a problem. The true transformation didn't happen in the flash of gunfire. It happened in the quiet moment he first pinned the badge to his chest. That act was a silent vow to kill the part of himself that was a Hatfield clansman. He had to consciously sever the ties of blood and tradition that had defined his entire life. To become Sheriff Hatfield, Bud Hatfield, the cousin, had to die. So when Bad Lias made his move, there was no internal struggle. There was no hesitation. The switch had been flipped months ago. He was no longer acting as a man, but as an instrument of the law he had chosen to serve, and instruments do not feel conflict. As he drew his pistol, the world would have narrowed to a single point, the threat in front of him. His years of relentless practice took over, his mind becoming a place of chilling calm. There was no anger, no hatred, not even a flicker of sadness for the boy he once knew. There was only a target, a distance, and a trigger to be pulled. It was the detached, predatory focus of a hunter, but his prey was his own family. He was operating on a level of pure, brutal efficiency that few men could comprehend, let alone achieve. And afterward, standing in the gun smoke over his cousin's body, he would not have felt triumph or relief. He would have felt a profound and chilling emptiness. It was the quiet that comes after a storm has passed, the silence of a void created where something used to be. He had proven his loyalty to the law, but the price was a piece of his own soul. He had become what the county needed him to be, a monster to hunt monsters. But in doing so, he had become a stranger to his own kin, and perhaps even to himself. The legend of the fearless lawman was born in that moment, but so was the ghost of the kinslayer that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The silence that fell on the ferry landing was heavier than a tombstone. Bud Hatfield's posse stood frozen, men who had seen their share of violence now stunned into stillness, not by the death, but by the identity of the killer and the killed. Sheriff Hatfield broke the spell. His voice was flat, devoid of any emotion, as if he were cataloguing supplies. He gave orders to secure the body and retrieve his cousin's weapon. He treated the scene with the cold, methodical procedure of a man clearing away a fallen tree from a road. There was no room for grief or hesitation. The law had been served, and now the paperwork had to follow. The body of Bad Lias was brought back to town, laid out on the back of a wagon. That grim procession was the only announcement needed. The news didn't travel by wire. It moved like a ghost, whispered from porch to porch, from one hollow to the next. A Hatfield has killed a Hatfield. The words carried a terrible weight, a sacrilege against the deepest code of the mountains. It was a wound cut into the very soul of the clan, a wound that would fester and poison everything it touched. For the Hatfield family, it was a moment of profound and terrible clarity. The lines were drawn. Doors that had always been open to Bud were now silently, permanently barred. Eyes that once held kinship now held a cold, hard judgment. They did not raise their guns against him, not yet. Their reaction was a silence more menacing than any threat. He was no longer one of them. He was an outsider, a tool of the very government they had fought for generations. He was a kinslayer. In the eyes of his own blood, his badge was not a symbol of honor, but the brand of a traitor. The official reaction was the polar opposite. The county prosecutor reviewed Bud's report, a document as blunt and efficient as the man who wrote it. It was a lawful killing. Bad Lias had resisted arrest. He had drawn his weapon. The men of the posse, shaken but loyal to their sheriff, corroborated the story. The officials who had hired Bud let out a collective sigh of relief. They had unleashed a force of nature, and it was working. He had done the unthinkable, the very thing no one else had the stomach to do. They saw a hero, a man bringing order through righteous, necessary violence. His power was solidified, his legend cemented in the halls of the courthouse. But for Bud, the hunt was just beginning. It was not a hunt for another outlaw, but a lifelong hunt for a peace he would never find. He had made his choice, and now he had to live in the world he had created, a world where he was feared by all and trusted by none. The ashes of his old life were all around him, the family he had forsaken, the traditions he had shattered. He was the law, but he was utterly alone, a solitary figure standing in the chilling silence that follows the final, fatal shot. The killing of Bad Lias split the county like a bolt of lightning hitting a 100-year-old oak. There was no middle ground left, no place for neutrality. Every single person, from the coal baron in his fine house to the farmer scratching a living from a rocky hillside, was forced to choose. The general store became a silent battlefield. A man's loyalty could be judged by who he tipped his hat to and whose gaze he avoided. A woman buying flour would fall silent if a known supporter of the sheriff walked in, the friendly chatter dying as if a cold wind had blown through the room. It was a war fought with averted eyes, tight-lipped smiles, and doors that suddenly wouldn't open. An unspoken conspiracy of silence descended upon the hills. Many knew the official story of the shooting was too clean, too simple. They'd heard whispers of a different tale, that Bad Lias was trying to surrender, that the second shot was unnecessary. But who would dare say so? To speak against Sheriff Hatfield was to invite a visit in the dead of night. People who had once been proud and outspoken now looked at their own children and chose to hold their tongues. Fear was a more effective lawman than Bud Hatfield could ever be, and it kept the community locked in a state of terrified paralysis. The truth, whatever it was buried alive under the weight of that silence. But even in the deepest fear, there were small acts of courage and cowardice that revealed the true heart of the people. A merchant, once a friend of Bad Lias, now made a point to give Sheriff Hatfield a discount, a public display of his newfound allegiance. A preacher, caught between his fear of the lawman and his fear of God, delivered a sermon on the sin of Cain that was so full of careful, veiled language that both sides could claim it as their own. Then there were the quiet acts of defiance. An old woman from a distant branch of the Hatfield family walked 10 miles to lay a single wildflower on Bad Lias's unmarked grave. A miner, his face black with coal dust, was heard to mutter kinslayer as Bud rode past, a single word of rebellion that could have cost him his life. And the McCoys, the old enemies, they said nothing at all. They just watched, their silence one of grim satisfaction as their great rival, the House of Hatfield, began to devour itself from within. The death of Bad Lias was not an end, it was a declaration. With that single act, Sheriff Bud Hatfield had served notice to every outlaw, moonshiner, and hot-blooded brawler in the county. The old ways were over. His posse was no longer made of Hatfield cousins riding to defend the clan's honor. It was a new breed of man. They were young, grim-faced deputies who owed their loyalty not to a family name, but to the paycheck and the terrifying man who signed it. They followed him into the darkest hollows, not out of camaraderie, but out of a deep-seated fear of what he would do to them if they refused. They knew they were not his kin, they were his tools. The hunt for fugitives under Sheriff Hatfield became a new kind of Appalachian horror story. He didn't send his deputies, he led them. And when he went into the mountains, he was no longer a lawman. He was a predator returning to his natural habitat. The very skills the feud had taught him, how to track a man through dense rhododendron thickets, how to read a footprint in a creek bed, how to move through the woods without making a sound, were now turned against the very people who lived by that same code. The mountains that had for generations served as a fortress for the clans, hiding them from the outside world, had now become Bud Hatfield's personal hunting preserve. When a warrant was issued, a chilling game of cat and mouse began. The fugitive would run to the hills, believing himself safe in the familiar terrain. But he wasn't just being chased, he was being stalked. Bud was relentless, a force of nature that did not sleep or tire. Men on the run would tell stories of going days without seeing him, only to find the ashes of a campfire still warm, just 100 yards from where they had slept. They would hear a branch snap in the dead of night and know, with a certainty that chilled their blood, that it wasn't a deer. The psychological toll was immense. They weren't just running from the law, they were running from a ghost who knew every secret trail and every hidden cave. The moment of capture was rarely a chaotic firefight. More often, it was a scene of terrifying quiet. After days of being worn down by exhaustion and paranoia, the cornered man would look up to see Bud Hatfield standing at the edge of his camp, a Colt revolver held loosely at his side. He wouldn't shout or make demands. He would just stand there, his eyes flat and cold, his presence promising a swift and final violence if the wrong choice was made. Faced with that unflinching, predatory stare, most men simply gave up. Hardened killers who had sworn they'd never be taken alive would slowly raise their hands, their will to fight completely broken. They understood in that silent moment that they were not facing a man, but a reckoning. The hunt would end not with a bang, but with the quiet click of handcuffs, a sound that signaled the total and absolute surrender of the old world to the new law of the mountains. The Logan County Courthouse, once a sleepy building of legal debate, transformed under Bud Hatfield's reign. It became a theater of fear. When the sheriff brought a prisoner to trial, the room was packed not with curious onlookers, but with a silent, tense audience of clan members and enemies, all watching each other. Armed deputies, loyal only to Bud, stood at every exit, their presence a constant, unspoken threat. The air was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with legal arguments. It was the ancient tension of the mountains, of blood feuds and violent retribution, now brought indoors and wrapped in the thin veneer of official procedure. The trials themselves became a grim formality. The defendants Bud brought in didn't swagger or boast. They stood before the judge with the hollow-eyed look of a cornered animal that has already accepted its fate. Their real trial hadn't happened in the courtroom. It had occurred days earlier in a dark hollow at the end of a relentless manhunt when they looked up and saw Bud Hatfield emerge from the trees. By the time they reached the courthouse, their spirit was already broken. Their reaction was not one of defiance, but of quiet, defeated submission. Even the sharpest lawyers learned a new set of rules. You did not aggressively cross-examine Sheriff Hatfield. You did not challenge his account of the arrest. To do so was to imply he was a liar, and you could feel the temperature in the room drop when it happened. Witnesses for the prosecution spoke with a newfound clarity, while those for the defense often found their memories grew foggy under the weight of the sheriff's quiet, unblinking stare from the front row. It wasn't jury tampering in the traditional sense, it was an atmosphere of pure, suffocating intimidation. The verdicts, when they came, were swift and almost always the same. guilty. The conviction rate in Logan County skyrocketed. The payroll robberies stopped. The open brawling ceased. On paper, it was a staggering success. The law of men, with its procedures and its juries, was finally working. But a chilling question hung over every conviction, whispered on the courthouse steps after the prisoner had been dragged away in chains. Was this truly justice? Or had Bud Hatfield simply brought the old ways of the mountains inside the courthouse walls? He had not replaced the clan's code with the state's law. He had merged them into something new and terrifying. He used the tools of the state, the badge, the courts, the prisons, to enforce his own absolute, iron-willed version of mountain justice. The mastermind of it all was Bud himself, and he was never on trial. He was the judge, jury, and executioner long before any gavel fell. The people of Logan County had order, but many wondered if they had sacrificed justice to get it. After the trials were over and the jail cells were full, the Hatfield clan did not declare open war on their cousin. They did something far colder, far more final. They simply erased him. He became a ghost in his own family tree, a name spoken only in whispers of contempt. To the world, he was the powerful Sheriff Hatfield, but to the people who shared his blood, he was a dead man walking. The price for his iron-fisted order was a profound and permanent exile. He had brought the law to the mountains, but in the process, he had lost his home. Bud's life became a strange paradox. He was the most powerful man in the county, yet he was also the most alone. He walked the streets of Logan, a solitary king, his throne built on fear, and his kingdom populated by subjects who hated him. The justice he escaped in the courthouse found him in the shadows. Attempts on his life became a regular occurrence. A rifle shot that echoed from a distant ridge, narrowly missing his head. A stick of dynamite found under a bridge he was about to cross. He survived them all, his uncanny instincts and sheer, stubborn meanness keeping death at bay. But it was a life lived on a razor's edge, a constant grinding war of attrition. The mountains themselves seemed to hold a grudge, and every rustling leaf, every snapping twig was a potential threat. He was not a lawman. He was a warden in a prison of his own making. Whether he was truly haunted by the ghost of Bad Lias, as the campfire tales claimed, is a question that lies buried with him. But those who knew him in his later years described a man hollowed out from the inside. The chilling calm he displayed at the ferry landing became his permanent state. The silence around him wasn't just a result of the fear he inspired, it was a reflection of the silence within his own soul. He had made a deal to bring order, but the cost was a lifetime of looking over his shoulder, of seeing his cousin's face in the eyes of every man he arrested, and of knowing that the blood he spilled could never be washed away. This was his true sentence, not a curse from a ghost, but the relentless atonement of a man living with the consequences of an unforgivable choice. As the years passed, and Bud's era of iron rule eventually faded, the community did what communities do after a great trauma. It chose to forget. It was easier to talk about the Hatfield-McCoy feud, a distant, almost romantic conflict, than to speak of the time when a Hatfield hunted Hatfields. The story was too raw, too close, a mirror that showed a reflection of themselves they did not want to see. The tale of Sheriff Bud Hatfield, the kinslayer who brought order, was buried under new roads, new coal mines, and a thick, heavy blanket of willful silence. Today, the name Hatfield is known across the world, often romanticized as a symbol of rugged Appalachian defiance. Tourists flock to see the statue of Devil Anse, the great patriarch, standing proudly in a family cemetery. But there is no statue for Sheriff Bud Hatfield. For his descendants, the inheritance is a far more complicated thing. They carry a name associated not with a legendary feud, but with a kinslaying. It's a legacy of uncomfortable silence, a chapter of the family history that is rarely spoken of, a ghost that still lingers at the edge of family gatherings. The physical traces of his reign are faint, like old scars on the land. The courthouse in Logan may have been replaced by a newer building, but the spot where it stood remains a symbol of his absolute power, a place where the law of men was bent to the will of one man. But the true monument to his legacy is unmarked, and it lies on a quiet stretch of the Tug Fork River. It is just an ordinary ferry landing, a place where the slow brown water slips past the banks, holding its secrets close. It is a place of profound and terrible memory, hiding in plain sight. The official records of his arrests and the newspaper articles praising his efficiency still exist, gathering dust in archives. But the true story of Sheriff Hatfield is no longer found in books. It has seeped back into the soil from which it came, becoming a piece of folklore. It lives on in the quiet conversations of old men on their porches, a cautionary tale told to grandsons about the danger of putting a badge before blood and the terrible price of absolute order. The coal mines have scarred the hills, new roads have been paved over the old horse trails, and the world has moved on. The people have chosen to forget the specifics of that dark time. But the mountains have not. They were the silent witnesses to it all, to the oath, the hunt, and the final fatal shot on the riverbank. The mountains remember everything. So we return to the question that hung in the air like gun smoke on that fateful day. How does a Hatfield bring himself to kill a Hatfield for a tin star? The simple answer is that he didn't. Bud Hatfield wasn't fighting for the law of the state. He was fighting for his own brutal vision of survival. He saw a world of chaos and blood that was being devoured by an even greater predator, the coal companies and their armies of hired guns. He believed the old ways of the clan were a sentimental weakness, a path to extinction. So he made a terrible choice. He became a monster to save the mountains from other monsters, sacrificing his own family and his own... This is a story not just of one complicated man, but of the brutal, heartbreaking bargain Appalachia was forced to make. It's a story about what happens when the forces of the modern world come for a land steeped in tradition, blood, and honor. Bud Hatfield is the personification of that collision. He was the iron will that brought order, but it was the order of the gallows, the peace of the graveyard. His life is a testament to the fact that sometimes the man who claims to be bringing civilization is more savage than the wilderness he is trying to tame. So the next time you hear the name Hatfield and you think of the famous feud, I want you to remember this story. Remember the man who was both a lawman and a kinslayer, a hero and a traitor, a savior and a beast. He was a man forged in the crucible of the mountains, who then used that fire to burn away the very world that created him, leaving behind nothing but the cold ashes of order. And now, my friends, another one of these forgotten stories has been told. The last gunshot echoed through the